All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am thrilled to have as my guest today, Audrey Omenson. Audrey, welcome.
Thank you so much, Guy. Glad to be here.
You are welcome. So Audrey is a licensed counselor based in Houston, Texas. She's been working in the mental health field since 2009 and is passionate about using somatic experiencing and other tools to support clients in reclaiming their body, identity, and agency post-trauma, focusing particularly in the areas of religious trauma and purity culture. In addition to this being a professional specialty of hers, it's deeply related to her personal experience and healing journey. After leaving the conservative religious spaces of her early life, she has found somatic experiencing and other healing supports to be crucial in the reclamation of her own body, agency, sexuality, and queerness. Audrey, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, of course.
So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Yeah, born and mostly raised in Texas. We moved a little bit when I was younger, but for the most part, all warm climates and southern parts of the U.S. and all of that. So, and currently, and for the last 20 years, I've been in Houston, Texas.
Wow. All right. Awesome. So there's a lot here in your bio that I want to get to, and we will. But how did all this start for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the therapy piece specifically. It wasn't anything that I don't think recognized was like a real job I could have until I was like in college. I mean, I had heard of psychologists and stuff, but it wasn't a thing that I had ever thought of, oh, hey, that sounds interesting. It wasn't until I was in like a developmental psych class in college and I didn't know what I was going to major in. And something sparked in my brain. I was like, oh, wait a minute, and then also in hindsight, looking back on it, I think we all self-select for our professions for a lot of reasons. And for me too, I think a lot of it was also, I had never really learned how to have emotions. I had never really learned how to really own my body or have a body. And so I think on a deeper, at that point, unconscious level, that was a big part of the draw for me too, was just even learning for myself, like, oh, wait a minute, what are these tools? What are these things? How do I do this? And in that process, then went to counseling for myself for the first time and all that sort of thing, and learned a lot from there.
So in the bio, there was indication that your own healing journey, the conservative religious spaces of your early life. Tell us what was going on there.
Sure. Yeah. So my family was very religious, Christian, evangelical, spaces, went to church 3 times a week. I was homeschooled.
Wow.
Yeah, I was homeschooled. So that's a whole subculture, even within the Christian space. So there's a lot of pieces there, and a lot of it, it wasn't all terrible, right? Like there's a lot of that was really beautiful. And some of my lifelong friends I've met through those spaces and that sort of thing. But there was also a lot of very restrictive messaging, especially from a lot of the churches that we went to and that sort of thing, where it's very fear-based, very can't trust yourself, don't trust your body, the flesh is sinful, like a lot of those types of things. And also a lot of negative messaging around sex, what that's like, all that sort of stuff. So it was very much, I'd say, moving into adulthood, especially my 20s, was this very interesting process of learning how to be a counselor and all of that. But also at the same time, like, I think learning how to be a more fully alive person just for myself through counseling, learning how to, like I said, have emotions, know what a body is, I'm still working through layers of that even now. Yeah.
If I may. So was there a point and oftentimes there isn't a point,
Yeah.
but was there a time or moments when there was tension where you were moving out of your childhood from that space into a new space where you began to say, wait a minute, I'm not comfortable in my body or emotions? How did that come up for you?
Yeah, it came up in a very intense, specific moment with my parents getting divorced when I was in college. And so growing up, it was a very like, this is the Christian ideal. If you follow what God says, all this other stuff, you'll be blessed with this great life. Marriage is kind of heterosexual marriage is the one of the peak examples of this. And then in college, it all just, the family system really fell apart. And that really slammed me into a lot of realities. Also at that time, I worked at a church, and that church that I was working at, kind of within the same year of my parents' marriage dissolving and all of that, also a lot of toxic things within that church culture came out. I was laid off. There's like a bunch of so there was several huge categories that all kind of went into crisis at one time. And I was really forced to figure out what the heck, right? Is going on. What are my next steps? How do all these things that have informed my existential framework for how I find my sense of meaning and purpose, how I make sure that I'm okay, how I, know how to navigate life have all dramatically shifted and fallen apart. And so it was a really big moment. And then kind of intense couple of years after that of figuring out how to navigate that.
What steps did you take to begin a healing journey?
Yeah, I cried on the floor a lot. At the time, I had some really close friends that were some of my roommates, and they were a huge support, sort of a chosen family for me in a lot of that. I also started to see, that was when I started to see a counselor for the first time. I had just finished college and was planning to go into grad school. And through that started to see a counselor. And that was also a really new, different experience for me as well. And then also interestingly, art, I've always been a creative, crafty person growing up, but I had never pursued art in any sort of real way, especially not painting. But I remember there was one day where the emotions were especially overwhelming, and I had been on a walk and I'd come back to the house and I was just pacing, didn't know what to do, my body was so restless because there was so much going on. And at the time, because I was in my early 20s and I was poor, I was like, I can't buy art for my house. Maybe I can craft something for the wall. So I remembered I had bought this canvas, and I went in the garage and I just started throwing paint at it, and kept doing it and kept adding to it. And by the end, it was I felt so much peace and catharsis through this creative activity. And eventually, I intentionally painted more, and I still have it framed in my house as just this reminder of hey, there's always these emotions can always shift, and there's always some beautiful things that can come out of even some of the most overwhelming moments. But I think that creative piece, that engaging my body piece, that was a really important healing thing. And I didn't have the counseling words, for that at the moment, but that was a huge step in me starting to shift. And I started making art a lot during that time. And that was a big outlet for me too.
Yeah, it really feels from what you're saying, this path and challenge and struggle to understand oneself, identity. And of course, you said that, and it was read in the bio too. So when did you start to become aware of trauma as a counselor, or even in your education? When and how did you respond to it? How did it reflect within you, in a sense?
Right. Well, it's still wild to me now that a majority of graduate programs don't have a whole trauma course as a required element of education. But, I heard it referenced a few times when I was in grad school, but always as oh, here's these here's the list of traumatic events. And, if you check one of these box, the way a lot of us, I think about it until we really learn about it. And then as I became a counselor, I knew, of course, some of my clients had that, but it always felt like, oh, well, here's this like very different thing. I can help them with this part, but I don't know if I can do that. And I always had some fear around approaching it. And I think a lot of that was also, I had fear around approaching it with myself in my own life, and my interest and desire to really move into that area didn't really land professionally until I had done a lot of that work for myself. And I think a big part of it was I had to really practice some courage just with myself of like moving into these traumatic things, learning about what this is, how it's stored in the body, what this looks like, what healing paths can look like for this, and increasing my capacity to sit with that, with those uncomfortable feelings.
With your own feelings.
With my own feelings. Yeah. That I think that was a big piece of that puzzle that had to land first.
Did you do that with a therapist? Did you do that? How did you do that?
Yeah.
You used the word courage there, which
Yeah. I've had a couple different therapists throughout my adult life, kind of that were different. All the ones I've had have been really great, but it shifted depending on what I was really wanting to focus on. And within the last maybe 7 years, especially at the beginning of that time frame, I found a really good trauma therapist who did more body-based work. And that was my first experience. I had heard about body-based modalities for trauma treatment, but that was my first experience with it. And it was like a game changer for me. I think earlier I used that phrase, like I didn't really even know how to like own and have my body. And I think that was a big piece. That was how I started to learn that part.
Just as quickly, I remember when I was in graduate school and it was, talk about somatics and stuff. And people were like, well, how do you feel in your body? And I was like, what do you mean? How do I feel in my body? Right. I had like zero connection to my body.
Right.
But so, I mean, I really appreciate you talking about, having naming that, the courage to find that and reclaim that. And so how did you get to a point where you're like, okay, I want to help others in this area? What did that look like for you? Yeah.
Well, I think a big part for me, especially that trauma work for myself, was a lot around the healing from the religious components of that I had grown up with and were unpacking for myself. And at that point that I really started that work for myself maybe 10-ish years ago. So religious trauma was a thing, but it wasn't nearly as well known of a thing as it is now at that point. So I had started to just like do some reading, research, just try to like, what even is this? What do I call this? And I stumbled across some books that were really helpful that gave me some language that like helped me put some handles on some of this stuff.
Do you know the names of anyone? Can you recall?
Yeah. One of them is Leaving the Fold by Marlene Winnell. She's like a big pioneer in that area. That's always the one I recommend for people as like the intro book. If you're, whether you're staying in a religious space, but shifting what that looks like or completely leaving religion altogether, it's a really important first step. That book really covers a lot of the big categories and also honors the really wonderful things that spirituality and religion provide too, because it's such a powerful way to experience community, a sense of purpose, like all this other stuff. And so that's part of why it can be like such a foundation shaking thing when it falls apart or changes. But yeah, so for that, like that piece, as I started to learn more about it with myself, started to do that trauma work for myself, I started recognizing it showing up in a lot of my clients. And I think it's interesting that I already had a lot of clients that were kind of in that space, that while I wasn't intentionally seeking them out, that match was still happening. And that was how I started into the religious trauma piece with people. Was I had started to get the language for myself, had started to do some of the healing for myself, and then was better able to recognize it and share some of those resources with other people. And then it grew from there.
All right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back. In the bio, I mentioned purity culture. You talked about that. What is that?
Yeah, so that's connected with religious trauma. It's real specific to that idea of sexual purity until marriage. And that's shown up in a lot of religious contexts. A lot, purity culture specifically was what this movement was called. There was like a big resurgence, like surge of it in the 90s into the 2000s, where it's like purity ring, waiting until you get married. Church youth groups would like have classes about it. I sat in a lot of those classes, but it's abstinence only. Heterosexual marriage is the goal. And anything that doesn't neatly fall into that category is evil, sinful, unsafe, bad. And typically a lot of how it's taught has a lot of fear-based stuff. Like some of the courses I sat in had like horrible pictures of what STDs look like. Like it was like this very fear-based thing. And so it's a lot of, and I'd say too, another big component is a lot of pressure is put on girls specifically to be responsible in quotes for not being too attractive to members of the opposite sex, because we can't be a stumbling block. That's a term that's used a lot, but this like disproportionate amount of responsibility for other people's like sexual attraction and that sort of thing. And then with the boys, they would get a lot of messages like you can't control your urges, you can't be trusted, and like a lot of negative, like you're just this wild animal, and like there's nothing. And so like both genders in that context got really negative messaging around that. Yeah, you can't win.
Now, you've kind of indicated that, and I hope I can say this, but you've kind of indicated that you're not heterosexual.
Yeah.
And yet, as you're talking about all of these pressures within the religion, and you're sitting there as a young woman, I mean, I can't imagine what this would do to one's identity. Yeah. Right. How do you manage that? What's going on? And I guess that's why we're talking today.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. My therapist and I still talk about it for myself. I'd say a big way I managed it was I just disconnected from it. Right. Like a lot of what I was saying of not knowing how to have a body and not knowing how to be connected with my emotions, not feeling a strong sense of agency, especially within dating romantic type categories, feeling very paralyzed in a lot of that, I think was a big part of how I navigated that. And it wasn't, I would say I was a late bloomer in terms of discovering my queerness, because that piece didn't fully come to the surface until I had done a lot of other work to learn how to really inhabit my body, and be a body and be a person and allow my desires to exist. And I think that timing was important too, right? Like, I don't think I would have known what to do with it if that awareness had come earlier. And I also think it's very tied to, learning to be more aware of what my desires are, started to inform a lot of my sense of sexuality and identity in those contexts too.
So when people come, or someone comes to you with a similar issue, help us understand how do you work with this? What goes on?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I usually tell every client who's coming to me, whether it's purity culture specific or religious trauma or anything like that, is I don't have a secret agenda for where I think you should land in your healing process and in what you decide your values and beliefs are and all this other stuff. Because that's a big part within those high control religious settings is here's the one approved, like defined thing that we're allowed to think and be and behave. And even if we pretend to make performative room for question asking, you're still expected to land back in the same spot. So like really making a lot of room for that. Maybe it's someone decides they do want to wait, but that ends up being their choice. Or maybe they decide they still want to go to another church, but it just looks a little different or whatever. Any of that is okay. The important part is really starting to build a sense of agency, like I am my own. Creating that space where they can reclaim those parts of themselves that had to be shut down.
So right away, it sounds like you're kind of presenting the antithetical stance. You're saying, look, there's no agenda here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's no agenda. And also, I'm not the new expert that's going to tell you how to live your life.
Right.
What's it look like to start to build up a sense of confidence in knowing what my own voice is? How do I start to know what the signals are from my body, from my emotions of, what boundaries do I need to have here? What desires do I want to pursue? What actually feels good? What doesn't feel good? Starting to build up more of that clarity of that internal voice, that internal sense of agency that, hey, I have choices. And I have the power to make the choices. I can't control all my external circumstances, but I'm still my own within that, and really starting to build that up for clients.
It sounds like, to be so restricted in feeling one's emotions and honoring one's body and desires, to have that imposed from the external almost sounds cultish.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say all of that exists on a spectrum, right? And so the more into the cultish end you get, it's a degree of how intensely the control is turned on. Right. And so you can have spaces where maybe they have some harmful messaging, but that control dial isn't cranked up all the way. And so you feel like you have a little more choice. You're not being excluded from the group if you're seen as impure, not making the right choice, right? Or and then you can go all the way to the other extreme where it's, we wear the same outfits, we do the exact same thing, we don't have any choice at all, right? So, but it's all on a big spectrum.
And I know there are many different reasons for why people do this, but some commonalities of why people come to you in this space. Yeah.
I'd say one is I'll see a lot of people show up when they are in that questioning phase. I'd say people show up in a couple different phases. So one is when they're still maybe in the setting, but they're starting to question it, or maybe they've had questions for a while and it's just creating a lot of distress because they don't know how to move forward. Because also a lot of times with these settings, either all or a large portion of one's community and relationships tend to be also in these religious settings. And so you're not just changing churches, you're also like, I might lose a good percentage of my family relationships, my friendships. Like there's typically a lot of categories of life that are at stake when these questions start to show up. So sometimes I'll get people with that, right? Sometimes it'll be right after the change. Again, where there's a high level of distress, a lot of things have really shifted. And I'd say those two things are the most common ways people will show up, is either in that question phase, but there's a lot of distress around it, or right after. But every now and then I'll also get someone where it's like, I left that church 10 years ago. And I've never even heard the word religious trauma, but I was like reading your bio, I was reading this other thing, and I saw this term. And when I read the term, it was like, oh my gosh, that's what that was. Oh, like that language, right? Like getting the real word for the thing. And so sometimes too, it'll be that where it's like someone's been out of it for a while, hadn't really thought of it, but then came across something where they learned that, and it's all kind of came back up. Because I think a big part is, do you feel like you have the support to actually work through some of the stuff, right? Because like doing therapy work, trauma work can stir up a lot of things. And so I think a big part too is that, like, am I in a place where I feel ready to do this?
You speak from your experience, you're sharing your own experience, and you're sharing your experience and working with your own experience as you work with your clients too. I'm wondering if you might be able to share like an early clinical error when you started working within this field, what that looked like.
Yeah, just
you.
one.
Yeah, just one.
There's quite a few, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, I think an early error that probably showed up in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different formats, was that feeling of once I got out of my depth or encountered like maybe a client asked a question or a situation came up where I didn't know the answer, that I would in the moment internally freak out like, oh my gosh, like I need to have the answer. They're not going to think I don't know what I'm doing. Right. And so I'd kind of scramble and, bullshit a response or, something like that. And that's not really helping anyone. And once I learned to accept the fact that, yeah, I'm not going to know everything. That's fine. It's not my job to be the expert here and to have all the answers for this. And in fact, sometimes there are questions, having another person be like, hey, yeah, that's actually really good. I don't know. Like that's a thing to explore. Or let me go like do some research, or let's just like explore it right now together. Right. Like that actually has so much more therapeutic benefits. But those initial fears of, oh my gosh, they're going to think I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't know what's going on and all of that sort of stuff would stick out and get pretty loud for me early on. So, I'd say learning that part was really opened up a big therapeutic shift for me with how I worked with clients. That was a big one.
To the listeners, therapists and survivors alike, what would you say to them, to those people who maybe are identifying with what you're saying and maybe thinking to themselves, holy, this is what I've been going through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think don't be afraid of the questions, right? Just because you've been taught that questions are a slippery slope or bad or negative or signs of doubt. Questions are actually just part of curiosity. And curiosity opens up so many doors to discovery, to freedom, to hope, right? And let those breathe. It's okay, right? It's okay to have those questions there, and find someone that you feel comfortable exploring it with, right? And maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's, someone new that you go out and, I think there's a lot of paths to start to find a space where, hey, maybe I can say some of these questions aloud, or process some of this aloud. And that, like, finding that community is huge. Because I think that, again, that either the fear of losing community, if you're like currently experiencing it, or the grief over past loss of community, if you've already come out of it, I think can be big. And so giving those questions permission, and finding some spaces where you feel some of that support, whether it's, chosen family, a trusted counselor, a mentor, someone, where you're starting to let some of that come to the surface. And, of course too, if it's getting too big, you can find a counselor and they can get you some support with all of that. But I say, just as a very early starting point, that's what comes to mind for me first.
Awesome. My guest today is Audrey Omenson. Audrey, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so it'd be my email address. So Audrey at therapycollectivetx.com, or you can just go to the website, which is that same handle, therapycollectivetx.com.
Okay. And how are you working with people? Are you just doing private practice? Are you doing any online stuff or what?
Yeah, so I'm full private practice, and I am telehealth, a large majority, and I have a small number of in-person appointment options opening up soon, but I'm licensed to anyone in Texas, and I also do like consultations and trainings, and that can be for anyone, anywhere, whether it's a therapist or someone else wanting to learn more about religious trauma, purity culture, and how to work with that.
Awesome. Audrey, thank you so much. I'd love to have you back at a later date.
Yeah, I'd love that. That'd be great.
Awesome. Appreciate you being here and appreciate you sharing your own experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Guy.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, you too.